The afternoon was hot and muggy in the quiet residential neighborhood of Oakwood, Alabama. Cicadas sang incessantly, filling the air with their constant hum. The streets, quiet and orderly, were lined with leafy trees and houses of simple architecture, each with its well-kept lawn. The shrill sound of police sirens cut through the serenity of the place, drawing curious glances from neighbors who peered behind the curtains. A patrol car parked in front of a modest house, painted a weathered white. The garden, although well-kept, was quiet, without the laughter of the children who used to play there. Two officers, veteran Sergeant Jim Harris and rookie officer Danny Ramirez, exited the vehicle. With firm steps, they walked to the front door. Harris, a stocky middle-aged man with gray hair and eyes that had seen everything, led the way. Ramirez, still learning the intricacies of the profession, followed him closely, trying not to show his anxiety. Harris knocked on the door with a heavy hand. The sound echoed in the stillness of the street. After a few seconds of silence, the door slowly opened, revealing a man of about 45. He was tall and thin, with untidy brown hair and sunken eyes marked by deep dark circles. He was wearing a crumpled plaid shirt and frayed jeans. "Good afternoon, sir. We're the police. We got a call. Could you tell us what happened?" Harris asked, his voice firm but gentle. The man took a step back, allowing the officers to enter. "Come in, please. My name is Robert." "Me? I don't know how to explain." His voice trembled, charged with an anguish that the police officers quickly noticed. As they crossed the threshold of the door, Harris and Ramirez exchanged a significant look. The tension in the air was palpable, and they both knew that whatever the reason for the call, it would not be something easy to deal with. The sergeant signaled to Ramirez to stay alert. As they entered, the atmosphere of the house seemed heavy, as if each object was impregnated with a silent and painful history. Robert led them through the living room, where family photos adorned the walls, showing happy moments frozen in time. However, the current atmosphere was gloomy, and the silence inside the house contrasted sharply with the joy depicted in the pictures. "It's this way," Robert muttered, leading them into a corridor that led to the bedrooms. As they approached a half-open door, Harris felt a shiver run down his spine. He knew that something deeply disturbing awaited them on the other side. As they pushed the door open, the sight that unfolded before them caused both officers to stop in their tracks. Harris's breath caught in his throat as he absorbed the scene. It was something that, despite all the years of service, he could never get used to. As they pushed the door open, the sight that unfolded before them caused both officers to stop in their tracks. Harris's breath caught in his throat as he absorbed the scene. It was something that, despite all the years of service, he could never get used to. In the middle of the room, a woman was lying on the floor, motionless. His eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, but lifeless. The expression on his face was pure terror, frozen at the moment of his last breath. Around her, a pool of blood slowly spread, dyeing the carpet a deep red. There were clear signs of a struggle: overturned furniture, a broken lamp, and torn curtains. Ramirez, still inexperienced in dealing with such brutal scenes, struggled to maintain his composure. Harris, on the other hand, immediately took control of the situation. "Officer Ramirez, we need to cordon off the area and call forensics. Mr. Robert, do you know the victim?" Robert, now pale as a ghost, barely managed to answer. She's my wife, Linda. I found her like this when I got home from work. I don't know what happened." Harris placed a comforting hand on Robert's shoulder, trying to offer some solace as his own thoughts raced by 1,000 an hour. He knew that this would be a complex and painful case, and every detail would have to be meticulously investigated to find out what really happened in that seemingly quiet house. The heavy silence of the house was broken by the distant sound of light footsteps. Harris, still shaken by the scene before him, turned to see a boy of about 10 standing in the hallway. He was cowering, his eyes wide with terror, holding a small teddy bear so tightly that his fingers were pale. "Who are you, son?" Harris asked, trying to soften his voice. The boy looked at his father, who nodded slowly, encouraging him to speak. "Me. I'm Tommy," the boy replied, his voice trembling. He took a hesitant step into the room, but stopped when he saw his mother's body. His eyes filled with tears, but he kept his gaze fixed on the policeman. Harris knelt down to keep up with the boy, his face now displaying an expression of care and understanding. "Tommy, can you tell us what happened? Anything you can remember can help us." Tommy looked at his father again, as if seeking permission, before he began to speak. "I was in my room, playing. Mom and Dad started arguing in the room. They argue sometimes, but this time it was worse. I heard a loud noise, like a gunshot. I got scared and hid under the bed. Then I called the police." Ramirez, still in shock at the scene, asked carefully, "Tommy, did you see who shot your mother?" Tommy shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't see it. I was very scared. I just heard the noise and hid." Harris took a deep breath, trying to put the pieces together. "Tommy, you were very brave to call the police. Now we need to ask some questions to better understand what happened. Do you know if your father has any weapons in the house?" Tommy looked at his father, who now looked even more dejected. "Dad has a gun, but it's locked in the closet. He always says it's for our protection." Harris stood up and motioned for Ramirez. "We need to isolate this area and ensure that no evidence is compromised. Ramirez, contact forensics and let them know we have a crime scene here." Ramirez nodded and quickly left the room, calling the switchboard. Harris, turning to Robert, asked calmly, "Mr. Robert, we need your full cooperation. Could you show us where this gun is and if there is anything else that can help us understand what happened?" Robert, still shaken, agreed. "Of course, me. I just want to understand this as much as you do. The gun is in the closet in our bedroom. I can show you." The three of them walked down the hall to the master bedroom. Robert opened the closet door, and inside was a small safe. He typed in the combination with trembling hands and opened the safe, revealing a pistol. Harris picked up the gun carefully, wearing gloves so as not to compromise the fingerprints. "We're going to need to verify that this was the weapon used in the crime. Mr. Robert, in the meantime, we will ask that you accompany us to the police station to provide more information. Tommy will also need to go with us. We understand that this is difficult, but it is necessary." Robert nodded, tears finally streaming down his face. "I will do whatever it takes. I just want to know the truth." The Oakwood police station, usually a place of routine activity, was now immersed in a quiet tension. Robert sat in a cold, sterile interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the metal table before him. He stared at the floor, lost in thought, as the minutes dragged on. On the other side of the mirrored glass, Harris and Ramirez watched. Harris, with his serious countenance, was thinking about the best approach to handling the interrogation. Ramirez, still trying to process the day's events, seemed uneasy. "He's in shock," Harris said, "but we need to get answers. The only way to find out the truth is to get him to talk." Ramirez nodded. "The evidence so far points to him, but that doesn't mean he's guilty. We need to hear your version of the facts." Harris took a deep breath and opened the door to the interrogation room. He entered, followed by Ramirez, and sat down in front of Robert. For a moment, only the sound of the clock on the wall filled the tense silence. "Mr. Robert," Harris began, his voice firm but gentle, "we need to talk about what happened today. The fingerprints on the gun are yours, and there's gunpowder residue on your hands. We need to understand what happened." Robert lifted his head slowly, his red, watery eyes meeting Harris's. "Me? I didn't do that," he muttered, his voice breaking. "I would never hurt Linda. She was everything to me." Harris kept his gaze, searching for any sign of truth in Robert's words. "We know you were arguing. Tommy told us. What was going on between the two of you?" Robert took a deep breath, trying to find the strength to speak. "Linda and me? We were going through a difficult time. We had disagreements, like any couple, but I would never raise my hand against her, ever." Ramirez intervened gently. "So what happened after the argument, Robert? We need all the details. Every little thing can help." Harris sighed, leaning back in his chair. "We will verify your claims, but you need to understand that the evidence so far is incriminating. If there's something you're not telling us, now is the time to speak up." Robert, with tears streaming down his face, shook his head slowly. "I swear, I don't know what else to say." Harris and Ramirez left the room, leaving Robert in his anguished silence. Outside, Harris rubbed the back of his head thoughtfully. There's something wrong here, Ramirez. We need to investigate further. Robert is lying about something. But why? We'll take statements from the neighbors. It'll help. The sun was setting over Oakwood when Harris and Ramirez returned to the neighborhood to continue their investigation. Shadows stretched along the sidewalks, and the air was permeated with the fragrance of jasmine from nearby houses. The tranquility of the place was disturbed only by the presence of police cars and the yellow tape that isolated the house of Robert and Linda. Police officers began knocking on neighbors' doors, looking for any clues or testimony that could shed light on what had happened. The first stop was at the house next door, where an elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson opened the door with a sad smile. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Thompson. We're with the police and we're investigating what happened to the family of your neighbors, Robert and Linda. Could we talk a little?" Harris asked, in a gentle tone. Mrs. Thompson nodded and invited the officers inside.
"Sure, come in."
"It's so terrible what happened." They looked so happy. Sitting in Mrs. Thompson's living room, the officers began asking questions. "Mrs. Thompson, have you noticed any suspicious activity at your neighbor's house recently? Anything out of the ordinary?" Ramirez asked. She thought for a moment before answering. "No, nothing I can remember. They were such a close-knit family. I always saw them together, tending the garden or playing with little Tommy. Have you ever heard heated arguments between them? Anything to suggest there were problems?" asked Harris. Mrs. Thompson shook her head slowly. "They argued sometimes, like any couple, but nothing that worried me. They seemed to love each other very much." The police thanked him and went to the next house. In each household, the responses were similar. Everyone described Robert and Linda as a happy couple, a family that got along with everyone and didn't seem to have any enemies. At a house down the street, they found a man named Mr. Harris, a retired Army veteran. He was sitting on the porch, watching the movement on the street. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harris. We are with the police and are investigating the incident at your neighbor's house. Can we talk a little?" Ramirez asked. Mr. Harris nodded, lighting a cigarette as he gestured for them to sit down. "Sure. Too sad what happened. Mr. Harris, have you noticed anything suspicious recently? Anything out of the ordinary at Robert and Linda's house?" Harris asked. He thought for a moment, swallowing his cigarette. "Look, they looked like a happy family, but every now and then I would see a strange car parked on the street, right in front of their house. I always thought it was from a friend or relative, but maybe it's something to look into." The police wrote down the information. "Can you describe the car, Mr. Harris?" "It was a black sedan, very discreet. Out-of-state plates, if I'm not mistaken. I've seen him about 3 times in the last few weeks." Harris and Ramirez exchanged significant glances. "Thank you, Mr. Harris. This information can be useful." As they walked back to the car, Harris spoke thoughtfully. "A strange car parked several times. That could be a clue. We need to investigate further." Ramirez agreed. "Yes, and we also need to check security cameras in the neighborhood. Maybe we can see the car and get more information about who was in it." With fresh leads in hand, the officers returned to the precinct, determined to uncover the truth behind the tragedy that had rocked the quiet community of Oakwood. The investigation was just beginning, and every detail mattered. At the police station, the interrogation room where Robert was being held maintained a tense silence. On the other side of the glass, Harris and Ramirez watched the clock, aware that Robert's lawyer was on his way. Every minute seemed an additional weight on the scales of justice, while the truth remained hidden in the shadows of events. Finally, the door of the police station opened, and a tall man in an impeccable suit entered with purposeful steps. It was Peter Sullivan, one of the most renowned lawyers in the state. He addressed the officers directly, with a determined countenance. "I'm Peter Sullivan, Robert's lawyer. I need to speak to my client immediately," he announced, wasting no time. Harris and Ramirez looked at each other before Harris responded. "Of course, Mr. Sullivan. He's in the interrogation room. Let's get him there." Peter followed the officers into the room where Robert was sitting, his head in his hands. When the door opened, Robert looked up, relieved to see the lawyer. "Peter, thank God you're here," Robert said, his voice heavy with despair. Peter nodded, placing a hand on Robert's shoulder. Don't worry, Robert. Let's work it out. I need you to tell me exactly what happened, without omitting anything. Any detail can be crucial. Harris and Ramirez left the room, leaving the two alone. Outside, police officers waited, discussing the next steps of the investigation. Inside the room, Peter sat across from Robert, opening a briefcase and starting to take notes. Robert, I need you to be honest with me. We already know that his fingerprints are on the gun and that there was gunpowder residue on his hands. What really happened? After Robert tells her everything that happened, Peter paused, absorbing the information. I understand. The police mentioned a suspicious car that was often parked near your house. Can you help us identify this car? Robert looked surprised. Suspicious car? No, I didn't know that. I don't remember seeing anything out of the ordinary. Peter made a note and closed the folder. We will focus on finding any evidence that can corroborate his story. In the meantime, we will need to face the charges. Shortly after, Harris and Ramirez returned to the room. Peter stood up, adjusting his tie. We are ready. You can continue with the proceedings. Harris nodded. Robert, you are being apprehended on suspicion of murder. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court. You have the right to remain silent and the right to a lawyer. Robert, his eyes filled with tears, stood up slowly. What about my son, Tommy? Where is he? Are you sure? Ramirez responded firmly but reassuringly. Tommy is safe at a relative's house. Don't worry about him. Our priority is to ensure his safety while we investigate what happened. Robert nodded, letting himself be led by the policeman. The truth still seemed distant, but each step in the investigation brought them closer to unraveling the mystery surrounding Linda's tragic death. With Robert now officially apprehended, Harris and Ramirez focused their efforts on following up the leads they had. They returned to the neighborhood, this time looking for security cameras that might have captured the black sedan mentioned by Mr. Harris. The first stop was Mrs. Thompson's house. Harris knocked on the door, and the elderly woman opened it with a welcoming smile. Good afternoon again, Mrs. Thompson. We need to see if the lady has security cameras that might have captured something useful. Could we take a look? She nodded, leading the officers inside. Sure, you can look. The cameras are in front of the house. Harris and Ramirez reviewed the recordings from the past few weeks, looking for any sign of the suspicious car. Finally, they found an image of a black sedan parked across the street. Harris made a note of the time and date. That could be helpful, Harris said. We need to check the cameras of other houses as well. They proceeded to nearby homes, gaining access to more footage. Over time, they managed to put together a pattern of the appearances of the black sedan, always at similar times, and the same subject getting out of the car and going to Robert's family home. Back at the police station, they compiled all the evidence and began to analyze the license plates of the car. The investigation was far from over, but each new discovery brought them closer to the truth. However, on the day of the murder, the car had not stopped there, which made everything strange, but of a certain strong exim. Robert's story seemed increasingly complex, and the search for justice for Linda was just beginning. Harris and Ramirez knew the key to solving the case lay in continuing to follow the leads, no matter how obscure or hard to find. With the security camera footage in hand, Harris and Ramirez were able to trace the license plate of the black sedan to a man named Paul Henderson. Paul, a middle-aged man with an ordinary appearance and a quiet posture, was located in his home on the outskirts of Oakwood. Police officers parked the car in front of Paul's house, a modest bungalow surrounded by a well-groomed garden. Harris knocked on the door, and Paul answered with a curious look. Mr. Henderson? Harris began, showing his badge. We are the police and are investigating Linda's death. Can we talk a little? Paul nodded, opening the door for the officers to enter.
Sure, come in.
I heard about the tragedy. Terrible what happened. In the living room, Harris and Ramirez settled into armchairs while Paul sat on the couch, clearly anxious. Mr. Henderson, we have images of a black sedan, registered in your name, frequently parked near Robert and Linda's home. Can you tell us why? Harris asked, maintaining a firm but courteous tone. Paul sighed, running his hand through his hair. Yes, I can explain. I did some services for Linda, Simple things like gardening and minor repairs around the house. She hired me a few months ago. Ramirez leaned forward, watching Paul intently. And why didn't you mention it before? This kind of information is crucial to our investigation. Paul shrugged, visibly uncomfortable. I thought it wasn't relevant. When I heard what happened, I was shocked. And when I heard that her husband was arrested, I was even more upset. Harris kept his gaze fixed on Paul. Can you tell us more about your relationship with Linda? What was her behavior like? What about Roberts? Paul hesitated for a moment before answering. Linda was a very kind person, always polite and friendly. I never noticed anything strange. As for Robert, I saw him from time to time, but we never had any problems. He looked distant sometimes. Ramirez noted the information. Mr. Henderson, were you at their house on the day of the incident? Paul shook his head. No, I wasn't. I was at home. I have witnesses who can confirm that. Harris continued, looking for any inconsistencies in Paul's story. And during the times you were in their house, did you notice anything suspicious? Any tension between Linda and Robert? Paul thought for a moment. As I said, Linda and Robert seemed to have a normal relationship, nothing that seemed out of the ordinary to me. I'm really sorry for what happened. The officers thanked Paul for their cooperation and left the house, taking the new information back to the police station. Along the way, Harris and Ramirez discussed the implications of Paul's testimony. He seems sincere, Ramirez said, but we still need to check his alibi and see if anyone can confirm his story. Harris agreed. Yes, and we also need to further investigate the relationship between Paul and Linda. There may be something he's not telling us. Back at the police station, Harris and Ramirez began checking Paul's alibi. They spoke to neighbors and friends, all confirming he was home on the day of the incident. Apparently, Paul had a solid alibi. Meanwhile, police officers continued to analyze the evidence. Linda and Robert's phone records were obtained, looking for any suspicious communications. It was then that they found something intriguing. In Linda's records, there were several calls to an unknown number, especially in the days before her death. The team traced the number to a disposable phone, which raised suspicions. Harris and Ramirez returned to focus on Paul. They invited him for another interrogation, this time at the police station. Paul attended, again looking anxious but cooperative. Mr. Henderson, Harris began, placing the phone records on the table. We found several calls from Linda to an unknown number in the days leading up to her death. Can you explain that to us? Paul looked at the records and took a deep breath. Yes, I can. Linda was worried about something. She asked me to get her a burner phone. He said it was something private, and I didn't ask any questions. I just wanted to help. Ramirez leaned forward, intensifying his tone. Mr. Henderson, we need to know what Linda was worried about. Your life may depend on this information. Paul looked down, seeming to be struggling with his emotions. She mentioned that she was afraid of someone. She didn't say who, but she was clearly scared. I thought it was just a couple's fight, but now I see it was something more serious. Harris nodded, taking note. This is very important. If Linda was afraid of someone, this can help us understand what happened. Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Henderson. We will continue to investigate. With this new revelation, Harris and Ramirez knew they were closer to the truth. Linda's fear and the mystery of the burner phone opened up new possibilities and directions for investigation. They determined to find out who was threatening Linda and how it related to her death. With each lead and testimony, the truth revealed itself, step by step, bringing them closer to solving the case that had rocked the Oakwood community. The weeks leading up to the trial were a mix of tension and uncertainty. Despite the tireless efforts of Harris and Ramirez, the investigation stalled, and the case remained shrouded in mystery. The truth seemed to slip through the fingers of the investigators, and Robert continued to proclaim his innocence. Finally, the trial date was set. The town of Oakwood eagerly awaited, divided between those who believed in Robert's innocence and those who were convinced of his guilt. In court, the judge, jurors, and the public were ready to hear the arguments that would determine Robert's fate. On the day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. The media was present in wait, recording every moment. Robert entered the room in handcuffs, accompanied by his lawyer, Peter Sullivan. His eyes were tired, but his posture was firm. The judge entered the room, and everyone stood up in respect. When he sat down, silence took over the atmosphere. We are gathered here for the trial of Robert Williams, charged with the murder of his wife, Linda Williams. The prosecution can begin with its opening statement, the judge announced. The prosecution, represented by Prosecutor James Collins, stood up and addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are here to prove that Robert Williams, on June 15th, took the life of his wife Linda Williams. The evidence is clear. Robert's fingerprints were on the murder weapon, and there was gunpowder residue on his hands. The prosecution will prove that Robert committed this horrible act in a moment of anger. After his statement, Peter Sullivan rose to the defense. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today we will prove that Robert Williams is innocent. The evidence against him is circumstantial and does not tell the full story. Robert was trying to help his wife after a terrible accident, and it was not he who fired the gun. We ask that you consider all the evidence before coming to any conclusion. The trial proceeded with the presentation of witnesses and evidence. The prosecutor's office called Officers Harris and Ramirez to testify about the crime scene and the investigations carried out. Detective Harris, Collins began. Can you describe what you found at the crime scene? Harris nodded. We found Linda Williams dead in her bedroom, shot in the chest. The gun was next to the body, and Robert Williams was found in the house, with gunpowder residue on his hands. Peter Sullivan, in his turn to cross-examine, asked, Detective Harris, could a desperate father on finding his wife dead not try to help her by accidentally picking up the gun and therefore leaving his fingerprints on it? Harris replied, It's possible, but there was still gunpowder residue on his hands, which indicates he fired the gun. Prosecutor Collins called other witnesses, including neighbors who heard the argument and the shooting. However, no one could provide a clear picture of what actually happened inside the house. Peter Sullivan then called Paul Henderson to the witness stand. Mr. Henderson, could you tell us about your relationship with Linda Williams? Sullivan asked. Paul explained his job to Linda and mentioned that she seemed worried in the days before the incident. What about the burner phone Linda asked you to get? Sullivan continued. Paul hesitated, but replied, she was afraid of someone. She never said who, but she was clearly scared. With all the witnesses heard and the evidence presented, the judge gave his instructions to the jury, who retired to deliberate. Hours passed, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Robert looked at Peter with a mixture of hope and despair as the murmurs of the audience filled the room. Finally, the jury returned. Everyone stood up when the judge entered the room. Has the jury reached a verdict? Asked the judge. The jury spokesman stood up and replied, Yes, Your Honor. Considering all the evidence presented, we, the jury, find the defendant, Robert Williams, guilty of second-degree murder. The room erupted in murmurs as the judge banged the gavel to restore order. Robert collapsed into his chair, dazed, while Peter placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. The courtroom was in a sepulchral silence when Robert, newly convicted, stood up with a determined expression. He looked directly at the judge and asked for the floor, his gaze full of urgency and resignation. Your Honor, I beg the floor. I have something important to say, Robert declared, his voice firm despite the obvious tension. The judge nodded, curious. I give the floor to the defendant. Robert took a deep breath, gathering courage to tell the truth. I'm not Linda's killer. It was an accident. I'm going to tell you what really happened that night and in the months leading up to it. Robert began to relate the events of the fateful night, his voice trembling slightly. Linda and I had a stable and happy relationship. We got married young and led a quiet life. We raised our son with love and affection, and we were a close-knit family. But something has changed in recent months. He paused, his words heavy in the air. Linda started acting strange. She became manipulative, distant. I didn't understand what was going on until I discovered her messages with a man named Paul. The room murmured, captured by Robert's revelation. Harris and Ramirez exchanged glances, processing this new information. I was devastated to discover the betrayal. I never imagined Linda would be able to do that. And then one day I came home and saw them together in my bed. The court listened in silence as Robert continued. So after meeting them in my own bed, I decided that our relationship needed to end once and for all. Linda cried, begged for forgiveness, but everything was ruined. The arguments became constant, and she realized that I was distancing myself. That's when she began to manipulate me emotionally, using our son as a weapon, threatening me and demanding that I reconsider. The situation only worsened with the constant presence of Paul in our house. Linda became more and more aggressive, more controlling. Not only did she verbally and physically assault me, but she also emotionally blackmailed me, making me feel guilty for thinking about leaving the house. It was emotional hell. I wanted to protect our son, keep him away from the quarrels and chaos that has become our home. But every day it became a bigger challenge. I worked to support our family while Linda, increasingly isolated in her emotions and manipulations, seemed to lose control over herself. At first, I thought we could overcome this. After all, we had built a life together, faced challenges, and were a close-knit family. But as the months passed, I found myself sinking into a pit of despair and heartbreak. There was no turning back. My mind was constantly in turmoil, trying to find a solution that would not only hurt our son, but also free me from this cycle of emotional abuse. I clearly remember the last time Linda attacked me. It was during a banal discussion about the finances of the house. She screamed, accusing me of not caring, of being an absent husband. And then, without warning, she slapped me in the face. I was stunned. I never thought we'd get to this point. My friends and colleagues noticed the change in me. I was more reserved, more withdrawn. I avoided going out with them, afraid Linda would create more trouble while I was away. Our social life, which used to be active and full of laughter, slowly disappeared. The few moments of peace I had were when our son was in school and I could breathe without fear of another emotional outburst. Paul remained a constant presence. Sometimes I'd get home early from work and see them chatting in the room, laughing like I didn't exist. Each laugh was like a knife in my chest, reminding me of the betrayal and failure of our marriage. I knew I needed to make a decision. Linda was unwilling to seek help, to change. She seemed trapped in a cycle of destructive behavior, and I could no longer be the victim of it all. For the first time in years, I started planning a life without her. It was a mixture of relief and pain. Relief at the thought that I could finally find peace, and pain at knowing that it would mean breaking up our family. When I finally told Linda that I was thinking of leaving the house, she was furious. He shouted, accused me of abandonment, of betraying our family. It was a whirlwind of emotions, but I stood my ground. Our son didn't deserve to grow up in a toxic environment like that, and I didn't deserve to live in fear of what would happen next. It was at that moment, when I entered the room to gather my things, that she was with her gun in her hand, threatening me if I left the house. I asked her to calm down, but Linda continued to threaten me. I couldn't believe things had come to this, but I knew I needed to take action to protect myself and our son. When I realized that she would not give in, I decided to try to get the gun back. I held her hand, turning it towards her, in the desperate hope of avoiding a tragedy. It was at that moment that the worst happened. Linda pulled the trigger. The room was in shock, murmurs taking over as Robert spoke. Harris and Ramirez exchanged glances, assimilating the new revelation. I was paralyzed with fear and guilt, Robert continued. I grabbed her gun, trying to understand what had just happened. I was in shock when the police arrived. I knew I would be guilty. I knew the evidence was against me, but I couldn't bear the thought of further tarnishing Linda's image. So I let you guys believe I was to blame. I didn't want that to happen. I didn't want to lose her like that. But now that's the truth about everything that happened that fateful night. Paul was there. He can confirm his involvement with my wife. I wanted to spare my son and his family from knowing the truth about Linda, but I can no longer carry this weight alone. I am willing to face the consequences, but my son deserves to know the truth. The court was in stunned silence after Robert's confession. The judge, visibly surprised, ordered a short recess so that everyone could process the new information. Harris and Ramirez took advantage of the break to discuss the new development. We need to investigate this immediately, Harris said. If Robert is telling the truth, then we need to confirm the details. Ramirez agreed. We need to review all the evidence again. Is there something we haven't seen? Meanwhile, Robert's lawyer, Peter Sullivan, spoke to him privately. Robert, Why didn't you tell me this before? It could have changed everything. Robert sighed, looking exhausted. I didn't want Tommy to know the truth. I didn't want him to grow up knowing his mother. He did that. After further investigation, and with the new evidence obtained from Paul, a retrial was scheduled. The evidence presented was overwhelming enough to exonerate Robert. The truth came to light, revealing the complex and painful details that surrounded the lives of Robert and Linda. The jury acknowledged the extreme circumstances Robert was in on the night of the incident. His innocence was confirmed before the law. Despite the relief of being cleared, Robert still carried with him the emotional scars of everything that happened. He would need time to recover, to rebuild his life, and help his son understand the complexity of the events that surrounded them. Thank you very much to those who have supported the channel financially through the link in the comment pinned. This helps me to bring more and more stories to you. And don't forget to like and also subscribe to continue receiving the new stories.